Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie. Lutheranism might not be the most recognizable Christian tradition in the high country, but one church, Grace Lutheran Church in Boone, North Carolina, has long made an impact in this area and is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. My guest today, the Reverend Troisi, is the senior pastor at Grace Lutheran and is here to talk about those 100 years, the season of Lent, and all things Lutheran. Welcome, Reverend Troisi.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pastor Steve, as I think you prefer. So yes. I appreciate you coming to meet with us today and to talk about what you're doing here in Boone. Maybe you can just start by introducing yourself, how long you've been here, what it's like to pastor a church in a mountain town.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Steve, of course.
Yeah.
I've been a pastor. I'm coming up on 14 years now. Grace is the third congregation I've served. We've been here about 5.5 years now. So we're coming around on our 6th anniversary here in the high country since our move from Austin, Texas before this.
That's a big move.
Yes.
So I didn't realize you'd been here 14 years. That's quite a long tenure, I would think.
Yeah. Well, 14 years in total through the 3 congregations.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, 6
right.
here
I
in
misunderstood
Boone.
that, yeah.
Compared to some pastors in Boone, that's for our congregation, this is still, I'm still just getting started.
Right.
We've got some pastors, famously Pastor Troutman was the pastor here at Grace for 27 years, from the 1930s into the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the one that really kind of developed the congregation for a key part of our history. And most pastors stay, 10 or 15 years since then.
So if you're coming from Austin, I would imagine that's a very different culture and very different setting for a Lutheran minister. Is there anything about pastoring a Lutheran church in the high country that strikes you as different or challenging in any way? Or
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly an interesting area. So you've got the mountains. The university also makes for an interesting combination of ministry. For me, I much prefer the pace of life here in Boone, especially compared to the city of Austin. I had like a 10-mile commute in Austin. It'd take me 45 minutes sitting in traffic. And so here in Boone, I've got a 2-mile commute. It'll take me 5 minutes if I catch all the lights. And so I like that pace of life. Also, for those of us who are here longer than 4 years, this is actually a relatively small town, too.
Right.
And so you get a chance to really form some relationships in the community beyond just the congregation you serve. I think that's probably the biggest difference, where in Austin, I did so much with really just the folks from the congregation. Here, I feel like I can be out in the community a little bit more and engage with folks across denominations and faiths and just in other realms of the community.
Yeah, so do you do a lot of interaction across denominations with other ministers? Is there a kind of ecclesiastical group here?
Yeah. So we have a multi-faith clergy and leaders group that's been meeting somewhat regularly, with COVID putting a big interruption in the middle of it. And that brings folks from the Jewish faith, the Baha'i faith, and of course a lot of different Christian denominations. And we're always looking to add new folks to this group. It's been a wonderful time. I feel like I have a good relationship with a lot of the local pastors. It seems that in other denominations, when pastors get up here to the high country, they try to figure out what they can do to stay.
Right.
And so there's a lot of us that kind of hunker down and are hanging out here. So yes, we do look to do ministry together. I even have a meeting later this week to meet with some other pastors and to imagine some new ministry possibilities for youth in our community across denominational lines. So it's been wonderful.
Well, I want to ask you a question. It might seem a little strange, but the Lutheran Church is not on every corner in the mountains, unlike maybe the Baptist Church and Methodist churches, which are more recognizable. And you have a collar, so you look a little different from maybe a Baptist minister. Is there any sense in which you feel marginalized or maybe even exotic in the area?
Yeah, it's certainly the case. If you just go down the mountain to Hickory, then you trip over Lutheran churches everywhere you turn.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there are little pockets of Lutheranism in North Carolina and Salisbury and Hickory area particularly. But up here in the mountains, there aren't so many. We have 5 Lutheran congregations here in the High Country. We all kind of work together in ministry, and we call ourselves the High Country Coalition. Mm-hmm. Now, there used to be a few other Lutheran churches, but they were relatively small, and as they've closed, some merged together to make another church, and the church out in Deep Gap closed and kind of came into grace many years ago. And so yes, five congregations across 3 counties is really not that many.
Right.
So yes, we are a little bit odd, I guess you would say, especially in an area that's so heavily populated with Baptists and some non-denominationals. And you're right, wearing the collar kind of does set us apart. You know, we are part of a Catholic Reformation, mm-hmm. and so those are our roots, and so we do carry some of those forward.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned Hickory, because I've noticed a big Lutheran community. Is that largely due to historical migration patterns, and what brought so many Lutherans to the Hickory area?
You know, that's a great. I'm not sure about why the Hickory area exactly. I mean, prior to Austin, we were in South Carolina, and I know that the hub of Lutheranism in South Carolina is around Columbia.
Right.
And part of that was the migration patterns were particularly the German wave of immigration was a little bit later, and so they had to settle further and further out. And so that's why they're in the Columbia area. I'm not sure exactly why Hickory and Salisbury, but Lutherans tended to sort of live together, stay together, build their churches together in that area, and stay in those areas.
So there weren't so many German settlements in the mountains. There was a lot of Scotch-Irish settlements, which brought certain forms of Presbyterianism. There was a lot of Philadelphia migration, which brought some Baptist traditions. Mm-hmm. But I guess we can explain the paucity of Lutheran churches to migration patterns largely, and maybe mission activity in this area. Are any of your churches in your coalition mission churches, or were they planted here? Or?
Yeah, so that's a great segue into the history of grace.
Oh, good. Yeah. So you're celebrating your 100th year anniversary this year,
and we are the relatively younger church of the Lutheran churches up here. But our history coincides with Appalachia State. In fact, our original location was the little pawn shop just down the road from where we are to the left. But it began as a mission outreach post. The Women's Missionary Society, which was a group of Lutheran women, sent 2 missionaries here to this area to provide textiles and other things that were needed in this community when it wasn't available to support this emerging teachers' college. And so that was our original location in 1923, and to serve this community. The worshiping community emerged kind of from there organically and grew. So even to the point where our original sanctuary wasn't built until 1929. So that's kind of a long lag for that period of time, but in part because we were so focused on serving this emerging town. You know, the town of Boone was not very large back then.
Right. And you're currently, I think I've got a picture here of the current facility. It's kind of at the corner of 421, I guess it would be East King Street and Hardin Street. Beautiful setting with the mountains in the background. This is pretty much how your church looks today, I think.
Yeah. So the large sanctuary on the right side of the picture was built in 1987, on top of the original parsonage, which we may see in a different photo. But to the left, the smaller building here is the original sanctuary. That's the 1929 sanctuary. Now it serves as our fellowship hall. And it's that old traditional style building of a sanctuary on top and a fellowship hall in the bottom.
In the basement, yeah.
In the basement. Yeah. And we still have that basement room, and we use it for offices. Our quilters use it. We have some NA and AA groups that use that space and share it with us. But that's and so if you're wondering just exactly where this is, we always try a few different ways to describe where we are before we cave. So we say, we're at the corner of King Street, right in downtown. And they'll say, it's the red brick church. It's the one with the stained glass windows. And if they still don't know, it's like, it's across from Daniel Boone Inn.
There you go.
And as soon as people hear that, they're like, oh, I know exactly where that is. So
we used to call that intersection Greasy Corner. Have you ever heard that?
I have heard that, yeah.
I think there were a couple of automobile mechanics on the corner there.
Yeah, I think all 3 of the other corners were gas stations at one point in time, except for where the church is.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the original building, which is now your fellowship hall.
Yep.
All right. And the parsonage is the house to that you see to the right, and that's where the new sanctuary is.
That's right, yeah. And then the building you can see in the back with the flat roof there is our education building, and that's still there.
Okay.
It's a 2-story. It's got offices and classrooms and music rooms and things like that.
That's really charming facade there with the ivy growing on it.
It looks a whole lot different because they have really expanded the intersection.
Right.
Originally, most of the parking for the church was around the front of it.
Okay.
And then a little bit up the side. But the way the road has expanded, we've had to add more parking lots behind the church to make room.
So other than the missionary beginnings, the building of the original sanctuary in 1929, the new sanctuary in 1987, which was a year before I arrived, actually, what would you identify as some of the seminal events in the history of the church, some of the important points in the development of this worshiping community?
Yeah. I think for me, the thing that we've really tried to dig in on more is this sense that we exist to serve and support each other and our community. Mm-hmm. And so all the key ministry activities I see in the life of our congregation and the ones that they're telling me about from the history all have that component of doing something to meet the need of an individual, whether that person's in the congregation or beyond.
Right.
And a couple of those kind of big events would include our participation with the founding of Hospitality House. In fact, most all of the organizations we have in town that serve in an outreach capacity, Grace was somewhere in the founding of that or in the participation of helping that ministry grow. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge part of who we are as a congregation. I think the other big thing that we began fairly early on is we're a seminary internship site, which means every year we get a seminarian, usually from Columbia, South Carolina, our seminary, will come up for a year. Our current seminarian is our 40th seminary intern over the history of the congregation, which is about the most that you could have. It's about as long as the program has existed. Yeah. And that is a huge component of our ministry in terms of sharing something with the wider community, because we work and nurture a candidate for a year and then we send them off to go serve elsewhere. But when it comes down to it, we are a campus ministry site.
Right.
We are the host for Lutheran students of Appalachian. It's probably one of our biggest ministries we do. What's not pictured here is we have another piece of property in the back with a big house that we use for campus ministry. Mm-hmm. And so from our very onset, it was service and campus ministry. And so I think if those two things we hold out in front of folks are all these ministries that they do not like when I say this. I say sometimes we're heavily committed to the most inefficient of ministries. The ministries that give stuff away.
Right.
Give away our stuff, give away our money, give away our time, invest in college students or in interns, and then they go away and we don't intend for them to stay. Yeah. And so if this congregation is doing things like that, then they're loving life and they're flourishing, right. and I think being faithful.
And your spouse, you and your spouse create a kind of team. I think she's working pretty heavily with college ministries.
Correct. Yes. She and I actually met in seminary. She did a different track to become a deacon in the Lutheran tradition. Is a seminary educated, rostered layperson is what we call it. So. And so, yes, she does campus ministry, and so she's primarily working over there with the students. Even today, they did hanging out with Deacon Stacy at the church out in the yard. I think they were probably outside because it was beautiful. Yeah. And so she kind of handles that. I kind of work a little bit more with the congregation, and there's certainly lots of crossover. Yeah.
So you mentioned one of the challenges of serving a church in a college town, and that is investing heavily in a group of young people who aren't going to be around to serve the church. They're going to go off on their own. Are there other kinds of challenges, or maybe, on the other hand, opportunities that present itself by being situated in a college town that you might not have down in Hickory? Well, I guess there's a college there too.
Yeah. Our Lutheran college.
This town really is a college town, right? Yeah. The university is so central to downtown Boone and so forth.
I would say, one of the things I tell our interns before they start, we usually meet in May down at the seminary before they start in August. And I say, our congregation doesn't mind being educated a little bit in a sermon. And so you better do your homework. You better work during the week. You can't show up on Sunday morning and shoot from the hip, because they're going to expect that you've put in some work. And I would say that raises the bar, certainly in preaching as one example, but certainly in teaching as well, that our congregation loves to learn, loves to soak up new ideas, loves to challenge ideas. And I would say we have a nice, healthy, robust conversation where when I'm leading, or even to an extent preaching, I'm not always the expert in the room. Sometimes we'll have religion professors sitting right there in the pew. And
well, one of my former colleagues and longtime chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religion here at Appalachian, Dr. Alan Hauser, is a member of your congregation.
Correct. Yeah.
So I never thought of that, but I guess that does put a little pressure on you. You can't get away with anything, can you? And he's a Bible expert.
Oh yeah, you better be careful when you're quoting some Hebrew. He's always been really wonderful and charitable. But in terms of kind of a unique aspect of the congregation is they like to learn, and they like to get new insights from preaching and teaching, and you don't always have to tell them exactly how to apply it. They're always good about trying to wrestle that out. And teaching at Grace is fun. You can bring one nugget of knowledge and then just let it go, and next thing you know, an hour's gone.
Right.
And because folks themselves are so knowledgeable.
Do you find that the students who end up in your ministry for college students, do they find their way to the Grace Lutheran? Are they coming from Lutheran churches back home and looking for a place to plug in, or is there outreach that you carry on campus that pulls them in, or maybe a little of both? I don't know.
Yeah, it's probably a little bit of both. I mean, some of them are Lutheran and they're coming from Lutheran congregations, but some are not. How do they find new folks? Of course, the most effective thing is an invitation from somebody else. But I find, so one of the things about our type of Lutheranism, there are a lot of different denominations of Lutheranism.
Right.
But ours is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and we've, since pretty early on, have taken a pretty open stance to people of all gender identities and sexual orientations and things like that. And I think sometimes in campus spiritual groups, that's a bit of an anomaly. And so there's a sense in which that kind of sets the group apart. And some people find their way into that space either because they've had some questions about their own identity, or they're just wanting to be a part of a group that's maybe more intentionally open.
Yeah.
And so I think those kind of combination of things. Some people that have grown up Lutheran are just like, oh, the Lutherans, let's go ahead. And some people that are maybe circling back to a life of faith, but doing so from a different place than they were maybe as a child.
Yeah. So given that, you have some outreach, you got some students over today. Today's Mardi Gras. We're coming up on the holiest season in the liturgical calendar for Christians. Tomorrow's Ash Wednesday. I think you've got a full slate of services going on tomorrow. And then, of course, the whole Lenten season. Tell us a little bit about the role of Lent in Lutheran liturgy and Lutheran worship. I know in some traditions it's more important than in others, but maybe you can give us a little slant on how a typical Lutheran would approach the Lenten season, and maybe how you're going to approach it that might be different.
Sure, yeah. Some of this goes back to Martin Luther, as he was sort of thinking about the faith from a different lens. He began to wonder about sacraments. And in the Lutheran Church, we have just two sacraments, baptism and communion, as opposed to Catholics that have, a few more. And but the one that he really wanted to be the third sacrament, but just couldn't fit it in, was confession. And so you would be really hard-pressed to find a Lutheran church that doesn't begin every single worship service, every single Sunday with confession. There's certainly examples of exceptions like Easter or Christmas or something like that. But most of our services begin with confession. And we see that as a key part. There's a sense in which Lutheranism constantly is maybe looking internal. So maybe not so worried about diagnosing what's wrong with our neighbors, but looking more internally at the ways in which we're still not yet there, and still somehow loved by God. And so this sense of not being fully there, or balancing this paradox of being saint and sinner simultaneously, it marks most of our worship, but particularly the season of Lent. What makes Lent unique, and not just the Lutheran tradition, is on Ash Wednesday we'll do a big, long, extended confession. but we're not going to hear any words of absolution, because the whole season is a season of confession, reflection, deeper thought about who we are and who God calls us to be. And so that's what the whole season is about, bearing in mind that Sundays are exceptions to that.
Right, right.
But we won't hear those words of absolution, except for Sundays, until Maundy, Thursday. And that to us is the key practice of Maundy, Thursday. There's some foot washing and some other things we can do, but to me it's those words of forgiveness, those words of absolution, these announcement that you are known and loved by God. That's powerful. So the season of Lent is that season of confession. So that can be marked by fasting, giving something up, possibly taking something new on, maybe a devotional practice or something like that. I would say for us in the Lutheran tradition, we have all that there, and certainly our folks, to an extent, participate in those practices, but it, to me, is more about the seasonal aspect of looking more deeply within, sort of prying out those darker places within and holding them up to the light to see them for what they are, and set ourselves free from those things, or be set free by God from those things.
Well, you mentioned Luther and confession. And I think sometimes what a lot of people forget is that Luther was a Catholic monk, and confession was a very important part of his spiritual life prior to breaking away from the Catholic Church. I didn't know, I learned something new. I didn't know that he really had a desire to include confession as the third sacrament. But that makes sense given his biography.
Yeah. It lacked the element. That was the problem. So baptism, we've got water.
Right.
Practical element, a thing you can touch. Communion, we've got bread and wine, a tactile thing. Confession doesn't really have the tactile thing that God promises to inhabit. And so that's what, in his mind, caused it to fall short.
Yeah. So the tradition you mentioned of fasting or giving up something, more popular practice, I guess, or adding devotion. This is in a remembrance, I think, of the 40-day fast that is attributed to Jesus in the Gospels, in 3 of the Gospels anyway, at the beginning of his ministry. But fasting it seems to me in the contemporary church is not a component as much as it once was in Christian observance and worship. Is that the case with the Lutheran observance of Lent as well?
Yes, certainly true. Yeah, and we don't have some of the rules or some of the guidance, let's say, that you might get in the Catholic Church about like fish on Friday or something like that. Lutherans don't follow many of these things that closely. I do kind of think it's interesting that some new diet trends are to encourage fasting for periods of time as a way of encouraging health.
Right.
And so that's sort of balancing those two together. But the whole season, whether you fast, maybe give away some money intentionally or give away some time intentionally, spend some more time in prayer or devotion, it's all designed around the same thing, and it's preparation. So we follow what we call a liturgical calendar. And there's a lot of different ways to describe it. There's wheels and all sorts of stuff. The way I describe it is there's 2 major festivals. We know what they are, Christmas and Easter. And each has a season that we prepare, a season that we celebrate, and the season after where we try to figure out, well, what does this all mean? And the season of Lent is in the preparation for Easter. And it has its roots in Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness, but there's also 40 years wandering with people of Israel. Right. But historically in the church, it was also a time of preparation for baptism. And so adults who were coming to the faith would spend a very intentional time in study and prayer and preparation. And then traditionally at the Easter Vigil, the Saturday evening going into Sunday morning, that's when all the adult baptisms would happen in the life of the congregation.
Okay. So you mentioned Maundy, Thursday, and you said that was the time for absolution, which is a big moment of celebration. You sort of in passing said one could practice foot washing.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a reflection, I think, in the Gospel of John, where Jesus at the supper washes his disciples' feet. Is this something Lutherans would normally practice on Maundy, Thursday?
God, it depends on the Lutheran church. I'm not a big fan of feet. So if I can avoid doing foot washing, I try to do that. So,
Okay.
but yeah, I would say probably a lot of mainline churches do try to find a way to incorporate that. But it's that reading from John's Gospel. It's
Right.
the Last Supper, and it incorporates Jesus beginning by washing the disciples' feet to prepare them to receive the meal.
Yeah, my impression is that most mainline churches in the mountains try to avoid it as well. But there's a long mountain tradition in primitive Baptist circles and old regular Baptist circles where foot washing is a very important ritual and almost probably a sacramental ritual in the life of their worship. So it's interesting to me that topic came up in the context of a setting in Appalachia where other traditions have been practicing that for some time.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So it's often connected with communion and other rituals. But
So you're telling me I have to wash people's feet this
I'm
year?
thinking you might want to think about it.
I got 6 weeks to think about that.
But these are the more kind of traditional, old-time Baptist practices that you won't find, I think, on the corner of King Street so much. So if you had to say what one thing that the Lutheran Church, and you maybe already answered this earlier about service to the community, but what does Lutheranism have to offer this area, the mountain area, where maybe traditional religions are more entrenched? Is there something unique that your tradition can bring to the high country?
We certainly are an interesting balance of traditional feeling, certainly in worship. And then at times, I hope, at least, a pretty contemporary approach to theology. Mm-hmm. And I think a pretty open approach. If there's a thing that I think Martin Luther brought to the church, I mean, there's maybe more than one. I am Lutheran. But it would be to embrace paradox, to embrace questions, to hold two things in tension that will never fully be reconciled, and to work out something in the middle. And I think our theology is all that give and take. And so we've talked about 100% sinner, 100% saint. It's just one example. We have this capacity to do amazing, wonderful, beautiful things that uplift life, and we also can really be hurtful and tear down life. And the same person can do that in one breath and then the next. And that is the beauty and danger of the life in which we live. And so the truth of the matter is, in Lutheran thinking and theology, is we'll always end up in a place of humility. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what makes us such a good partner. That's why we like working with other traditions, other faith traditions, other denominations, because we kind of like our Lutheran way. But just because we like our Lutheran way doesn't mean there's not another way.
Right.
I might not find that other way quite as compelling because I am Lutheran, but they don't have to be wrong in order for me to be right.
Yeah. Well, there were several words that I kind of heard. Mm-hmm. Paradox, one, and being comfortable in paradox. I think that's an important notion. Humility. Mm-hmm. And then earlier you talked about having an inclusive spirit, and I think that's really important when you're dealing with college students in particular, because college students are pushing religion in ways that religion might not want to go in many cases.
Yes.
So it's good that you are meeting them where they are. It's what it sounds like to me.
And they're challenging us and pulling us along too. We just finished a book study led by college students where congregation members were invited to participate. And it was a fascinating conversation. The way that they both love the church and also challenge it at the same time is really an interesting balance. What I love about this generation of young people is they don't necessarily hate all institutions, but they also are not content to let institutions hurt people or not fulfill their purpose. And so they do have some optimism that institutions might work, like, say, a church, but they have a low tolerance for us to stay where we were.
They have a low tolerance for hypocrisy too, I found. So they can sniff that out from way away. So let's end on that note of optimism. And I appreciate you coming and talking to us about Lutheranism and your place in the community. So happy to have you here, both the church and your leadership. So it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, and have a good Lenten season. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwalt, and I hope you will join us next week on App TV, where we'll be talking about some alternative ways of approaching spirituality.